Hello everyone. Next, let's learn about aggregation functions. When we talk about aggregation functions, the first thing we need to understand is what aggregation is. If you haven't encountered this before, I will start with something that everyone is more familiar with to explain the concept of aggregation. Okay, this is the Excel table we have been demonstrating to you. Just now, what did I do? I created a new sheet and then inserted a pivot table. A pivot table is a feature that all of you are likely to use and frequently use. I created a new pivot table, grouped and summarized the sales and profits by product category. In fact, this process is an aggregation process. Similarly, in our Find BI, we can also perform aggregation. For example, I can drag the product category over, along with sales and profits. If you compare it with the result in the pivot table just now, you'll see that it's actually the same. These are the two comparison charts below. One is the aggregation performed in our component. So, what are the benefits of aggregation? By aggregating, we can simplify the huge dataset of more than 50,000 records and extract the overall information, making it easier for us to understand and analyze later. This helps us make business decisions. For example, I now want to analyze the sales and profits of different categories. Then check my inventory, or see which major category is performing better in sales. So, just now through the pivot table and our components, we understood what aggregation is. And the corresponding concept is detail calculations. I hope everyone can understand these two concepts. For example, here I simplified a simple table showing the sales and quantities of different products in different regions. First, I want to calculate the unit price of different products. I can use a single row, that is, sales divided by quantity, which gives us the unit price. As you can see, each row remains the same as the original data structure, but a new column has been added. And each row corresponds to a value. This process is a detail calculation. As for aggregation calculation, as you understood earlier, we want to look at the total sales for different regions. First, we group by region and then sum the sales in each group. This process is aggregation. Okay, now we understood what aggregation is, and then we look at aggregation calculations. Next, let's check the aggregation functions available in Find BI. The different aggregation functions are categorized based on our use case. We may want to sum, average, count distinct, find the maximum, the minimum, and so on. Generally speaking, the functions at the top are the most commonly used. What I just showed you is the summing process. If we want to count how many products there are, we can use the functions listed below. So, what are the usage scenarios of aggregation functions? Generally, we will use the aggregated values for further calculations. These will dynamically adjust as we switch the analysis dimension. Let's use an aggregation function. For example, I want to calculate the total sales. And I'll use the sum_agg function, which is for summing. Then, we drag the total sales over. You can see that it's the same as the sales value we dragged earlier. Because earlier, this was a summing process. As I mentioned, the value of this indicator will dynamically change with the switching of our dimensions. How do we understand this? For example, right now, I'm summing sales by categories. But now I want to sum sales by regions. You can see that now it dynamically calculates the value for this indicator. Since I used the sum_agg function or the aggregation function, the result is the same as if we directly drag it into the group table. Because it's all an aggregation process. So, what is the purpose of aggregation functions? As I mentioned earlier, we use the functions because when we drag a value directly, It only shows the sales total. But if we want to use the result for further calculations, then we need to use a function. Let me show you an example. Here, let's go by category. Do you remember in the previous example, we calculated the gross profits rate? That was calculated by dividing the gross profits by the sales amount. You can see that the gross profits rate is correct. However, in the process of calculating the gross profits rate, I saw that some of you might make some common mistakes. For example, one mistake is that some of you, instead of doing it in the component, might add a formula column when editing data and then calculate profit divided by sales. You can see that it throws an error. Direct use of aggregation functions is not supported. Why does this error appear in the data editing, but not in the component? Actually, this is a small point I mentioned earlier. In the data editing, we are performing a detail calculation process, meaning we don't change or break the original structure. We just add a new column. Every row corresponds to a value. Do you remember the functions we discussed before, such as splitting or merging? Each row corresponds to a value, and in data editing, there is no concept of dimensions and metrics. So it doesn't recognize or calculate aggregation functions. In the component, however, we have this category dimension, which groups and summarizes the data accordingly. That's why it works in the component. This is the first common mistake. Remember, don't use aggregation functions directly in data editing. The second mistake is, when calculating the gross profits rate, we first sum the profit and sales, and then divide them. Some people might ask why we can't divide them first and then sum. What happens if we directly divide profit by sales and then add them up? Let me show you the wrong way of calculating the gross profits rate. For example, I directly use profit divided by sales and then drag it over. You can see that the gross profits rate is very large, over 300, which is not possible. Everyone knows that gross profits rate should not exceed 1. So, why does this error occur? This is because of the difference between sum AGG, A, dividing sum AGG, B, and sum AGG, A dividing B. It's important to understand the difference between summing first and dividing later, versus dividing first and then summing. Let me abstract the data table to show you the error caused by both methods. For example, we first sum the gross profit and sales, then divide them to calculate the gross profits rate. But if we divide profit by sales first and then sum, we get an incorrect gross profits rate. So, remember to avoid this mistake. These 2 points are very important.